My name is Aletta, and I was 7 years old when my family shattered into fragments. Dad grabbed Jackson, Mom clutched Amanda, and I stood in the middle of our living room unclaimed. No one wanted the middle child. State care became my reality, while my siblings went with their preferred parent. Now, at 28, I have built a life from the ashes of abandonment. Suddenly, they all want back in my life. But the little girl they left behind no longer exists. Before I share my story, let me know where you are watching from. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to rebuild yourself after someone broke you. Before everything fell apart, we were the picture of an average American family. At least that is what my 4-year-old self believed. We lived in a modest 3-bedroom home in suburban Maryland, with a small backyard where my siblings and I would chase each other until our lungs burned with exhaustion and joy. My father, Gerald, worked in construction, leaving the house before dawn with his steel lunchbox and returning with dust clinging to his weathered skin. My mother, Tiffany, worked part-time as a receptionist at a dental office, balancing work with caring for 3 energetic children. Jackson was 2 years older than me, already in school and full of stories about his adventures in first grade when I was still in preschool. He idolized our father, following him around on weekends, begging to hold tools and learn how to fix things around our aging house. Dad would ruffle his hair and call him his right-hand man, and Jackson would beam with pride. Amanda was 2 years younger, still a toddler when my memories begin to form concrete shapes. She had our mother wrapped around her finger with her bouncy curls and infectious giggle. Mom would dress her in frilly outfits and parade her around like a living doll, something I never experienced, despite my secret wishes for the same attention. I existed in the middle space, not quite commanding the respect of being the eldest, nor receiving the doting affection reserved for the baby. I was just Aletta, the middle child who helped Mom with chores and tried to join in when Dad taught Jackson things. Sometimes they included me, sometimes they forgot I was there. Early on, I learned to make myself useful rather than noticeable. The first cracks in our family foundation appeared around my 6th birthday. Dad started coming home later, his breath sour with something I would later recognize as whiskey. Mom would smile tightly when he walked through the door, but the smile vanished the moment he turned away. They thought we were asleep when they argued at night, but the walls in our house were thin and their whispers had a way of transforming into hissed accusations that seeped through the vents. Money troubles were a constant theme. Bills piled up on the kitchen counter, stamped with angry red warnings that I could not read but understood were bad. Dad took extra shifts, coming home even later and more irritable. Mom started working additional days, leaving us with Mrs. Bennett from next door, who smelled like mothballs, and made us sit quietly watching public television while she dozed in a recliner. Despite the tension, we still had moments of family harmony that I clung to with desperate hope. The summer I turned 7, just 3 months before everything imploded, we went to Lake Wilson for a picnic. Dad seemed like his old self, tossing Jackson into the water amid shrieks of delight, while Mom spread a checkered blanket and arranged sandwiches with unusual care. Amanda gathered wildflowers along the shore, presenting them to Mom, who tucked one behind each of our ears. I remember wading into the cool water, watching sunlight dance across its surface, feeling a rare moment of perfect belonging. That day, Dad hoisted me onto his shoulders, something he usually reserved for Jackson. I could see for miles from my perch, his strong hands gripping my ankles to keep me steady. Mom took a photo of us, our faces split with identical grins. That picture would become my most treasured possession in the years to come. Evidence that once, even briefly, I had been chosen. The arguments escalated in the weeks that followed. No longer confined to late-night whispers, they erupted at dinner, during weekend breakfasts, in the car, on the way to the grocery store. Mom would cry mascara, tracking black rivers down her cheeks. Dad would punch walls, leaving dents in the plaster that he never repaired. Jackson started acting out at school, picking fights with classmates and talking back to teachers. Amanda developed a habit of hiding in closets during arguments, clutching her favorite stuffed rabbit with white-knuckled fists. I became the silent observer, the emotional barometer of our disintegrating home, trying desperately to predict and prevent the next explosion. Dad started drinking more openly, no longer hiding bottles in the garage, but keeping them on the kitchen counter. Some nights he did not come home at all. Mom alternated between frantic phone calls trying to locate him and cold, brittle silence when he finally appeared. The smell of alcohol permanently replaced his familiar scent of sawdust and coffee. Mom became emotionally erratic, smothering us with affection one moment and pushing us away the next. She would sit at the kitchen table for hours, staring at nothing, only to suddenly spring into cleaning frenzies that lasted until dawn. One day, she cut her hair short and dyed it blonde, laughing with an edge of hysteria when we barely recognized her at school pickup. Through it all, I tried to be the good child, the peacemaker. I earned perfect marks in school, kept my room tidy, helped with Amanda without being asked, and never complained. I thought if I could just be perfect enough, invisible enough, helpful enough, I could somehow hold our family together through sheer force of will and good behavior. I did not understand then that some broken things cannot be fixed, especially by a 7-year-old girl trying desperately to matter. The night our family finally splintered beyond repair began like many others. Dad came home late, stumbling through the front door while we were finishing the macaroni and cheese Mom had made for dinner. The television hummed in the background cartoons, providing a thin veil of normalcy over the tension that hung in the air like smoke. What made this night different was the suitcase Dad carried, a battered brown thing I recognized from our rare family vacations. He dropped it by the door with a thud that seemed to echo through our small house. Mom looked up from where she was, half-heartedly pushing pasta around her plate, her fork freezing mid-motion. For a moment, nobody spoke. Jackson and Amanda continued eating, too young to fully grasp the significance of that suitcase, but I knew. Something inside me had been waiting for this moment, bracing for impact like you do before a car crash. Dad cleared his throat. His voice was steadier than I expected. When he announced, "I am leaving. I cannot do this anymore. I am taking Jackson with me." The words landed like physical blows. Mom leapt from her chair, sending it clattering to the floor behind her. "No," she screamed, her face contorting. "You are not taking my son." Dad laughed, a hollow sound with no humor. "Your son? Now, you care about your son. Where were you when he needed help with his science project? When he had nightmares?" The fight escalated quickly, words becoming weapons aimed to wound rather than communicate. They hurled accusations about money spent, affection, withheld promises broken. Through it all, they divided our possessions, our home, our future. Dad would take the car. Mom would keep the house, at least until the bank took it. Dad would continue paying the bills until she found full-time work. Then came the moment that would define the rest of my childhood. Dad turned to Jackson, who sat frozen with a fork halfway to his mouth, and said, "Go pack your things, buddy. We are staying with Uncle Frank for a while." Mom made a strangled sound and rushed to Amanda, pulling her from her booster seat and clutching her to her chest. "Fine," she spat. "Take him. But Amanda stays with me. She is mine." They stood there, each clutching a child like a shield or a prize, and I sat at the table untouched, unclaimed. Neither of them looked at me. Neither of them said my name. Neither of them seemed to remember I existed at all. Dad took Jackson to his room to pack. Mom carried Amanda to hers, whispering fierce promises of how they would be fine on their own. I remained at the table, surrounded by half-eaten dinner and the debris of our family life, paralyzed by the realization that in the division of assets I had been overlooked. Eventually, I found my voice small and trembling. "What about me?" I asked the empty kitchen. But there was no answer. I wandered into the hallway where Dad was zipping up a duffel bag filled with Jackson's clothes. "What about me, Daddy?" I repeated louder this time. He looked at me with red-rimmed eyes, his expression a mixture of guilt and something else I could not name. "You will stay with your mother," he said after a long pause. But Mom said the same thing when I asked her. "You will stay with your father," she insisted, not meeting my eyes as she folded tiny dresses into Amanda's suitcase. The argument that followed was brief but devastating. Neither wanted the burden of an additional child. Mom claimed she could barely support herself and Amanda. Dad said he was already stretching his resources, taking Jackson. They spoke about me as if I were a piece of furniture too large to fit in either of their new living arrangements. That night, with my parents unable to agree on who would take me, our neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, was called. She arrived in her bathrobe, her face pinched with concern, as she led me across the lawn to her house. "It is just for tonight, sweetie," she assured me. "They will figure it out in the morning." But morning brought a social worker named Natalie instead of a solution. She had kind eyes and a soft voice as she explained that I would be going to a temporary home while my parents sorted out their situation. She helped me pack a small bag, allowing me to bring my stuffed bear and the lake photo, promising that this was just a brief detour in my life journey. I did not cry when Dad drove away with Jackson in the passenger seat, my brother staring straight ahead as if afraid to look back. I did not cry when Mom locked herself in her bedroom with Amanda refusing to come out to say goodbye. I did not cry in Natalie's car as we drove away from the only home I had ever known. The tears would come later in the dark of an unfamiliar bedroom, muffled by a pillow that smelled of laundry detergent instead of home. The emergency foster placement was with the Johnson family, who had 3 foster children already. Mrs. Johnson showed me to a small bed in a room I shared with 2 other girls. She was efficient rather than warm, explaining house rules and schedules, with the practiced air of someone who had given the same speech many times. Mr. Johnson barely looked up from his newspaper when I was introduced, merely nodding in acknowledgement of my existence. That first night, lying in a strange bed listening to the unfamiliar breathing patterns of children who were not my siblings, reality began to sink in. I was alone. My family had broken, and in the breaking, I had been discarded like something unwanted. I tried to understand what I had done wrong, what flaw in me had made me so easy to leave behind. Was I not smart enough like Jackson? Not cute enough like Amanda? Had I been too quiet, too forgettable? In the weeks that followed, I wrote letters to my parents, painfully formed in my childish handwriting. I asked when I could come home. I promised to be better, though I did not know what better meant in this context. I begged them not to forget me. Natalie said she delivered them, but no replies ever came. Eventually, I stopped writing, stopped hoping, stopped expecting anyone to claim me as their own. My first real foster placement came after 2 weeks with the Johnsons. The Bradley family seemed perfect at first glance. Susan and Robert Bradley lived in a spacious 4-bedroom house with a swing set in the backyard and a golden retriever named Buddy. They greeted me with bright smiles and a bedroom decorated in purple, which Susan proudly announced she had prepared especially for me. For the first month, I thought I had landed in a fairy tale. Susan packed my lunches with little notes drawn on napkins. Robert taught me to ride the bicycle they gave me for no special occasion. They took photos of me for their family album and displayed them on the mantel, alongside pictures of their biological children now grown and living in different states. The facade began to crack when I overheard them discussing the foster care payment with a friend. "It turns out we get almost $800 a month for her," Susan said, "and the requirements are pretty minimal." Robert chimed in about tax benefits and how they were saving for a vacation to Hawaii with the extra income. Something shifted inside me that day. Their smiles seemed less genuine, their affection calculated. I began noticing how they documented every expense related to me with meticulous care, how they would buy the cheaper options for my clothes, while their own closets filled with new items, how they would boast to friends about their generosity in taking in a foster child while privately counting the financial benefits. School became another battlefield. In my old school, I had been just another kid. Now I was the foster child, a status that somehow marked me as different. Children can be cruel in their curiosity. They asked intrusive questions about my real parents, why nobody wanted me if I was bad or defective somehow. Teachers gave me pitying looks and spoke about me in hushed tones when they thought I could not hear. After 8 months with the Bradleys, I was moved again. No dramatic reason was given. They simply decided they wanted to travel more, and a foster child was too restrictive. Just like that, I was repacked into the same duffel bag, this time slightly fuller with accumulated possessions, and transferred to the Miller family. The Millers made no pretense of warmth. Judith Miller ran her household with military precision and viewed foster care as a form of charity rather than parenthood. Her husband Howard barely acknowledged my presence, grunting responses when directly addressed, but otherwise ignoring the children in his home. They had 2 biological teenage sons who resented sharing their space and made sure I knew it. Emotional abuse leaves no visible bruises but cuts just as deep. Judith had a talent for devastating comments delivered with a smile. "You are lucky we took you in," she would say. "Not many families want damaged goods." Or when I brought home a perfect spelling test. "That is surprising. Foster children usually struggle academically." Howard contributed with his silence, refusing to engage or protect me from his wife's subtle cruelty. The sons took their cues from their parents, alternating between ignoring me completely and making derogatory comments about charity cases and government handouts. 9 months into my stay with the Millers, Natalie arranged a meeting with my mother. Hope bloomed inside me like a fragile flower. Finally, I thought. Finally, she wants me back. I spent hours choosing my outfit, practicing what I would say, imagining the tearful reunion that would lead to me going home where I belonged. Mom never showed up. Natalie and I sat in a fast food restaurant for 2 hours, my chocolate milkshake melting untouched as I watched the door with increasingly desperate hope. Eventually, Natalie called only to learn that Mom had decided a visit would be too emotionally difficult for Amanda, who apparently still did not know what had happened to me. That night, I built the first brick in the wall that would eventually surround my heart. I stopped crying into my pillow. I stopped asking Natalie about my parents. I stopped hoping for rescue. Instead, I began to adapt to survive, to protect the fragile core of myself from further damage. The Millers kept me for almost a year before deciding they were too old to deal with a child entering pre-adolescence. I was transferred again, this time to the Simpson family. Carl and Denise Simpson already had 4 foster children when I arrived, all of us sharing 2 small bedrooms in their rundown duplex. The situation quickly revealed itself to be motivated by the foster care payments rather than any desire to help children in need. While the Millers had specialized in emotional wounds, the Simpsons dealt in physical intimidation. Carl had a hair trigger, temper, and heavy hands. Transgressions as minor as leaving a light on or using too much shampoo could result in being grabbed by the arm hard enough to leave finger-shaped bruises, or being locked in a closet for hours as punishment. Denise was no protector, turning a blind eye to her husband's methods, while maintaining plausible deniability with social services. I learned to make myself invisible, to anticipate needs before they were expressed, to become the perfect child who never caused trouble or required attention. The other foster children and I formed a silent alliance, warning each other with subtle signals when Carl was in one of his moods, covering for each other. When possible, sharing small comforts in secret. At 11 years old, after witnessing Carl throw 8-year-old Devin against a wall for spilling juice on the carpet, I made the decision to run away. I packed my treasured photo and the few clothes that still fit into my school backpack and slipped out a bathroom window during the night. I had no plan beyond escape, no destination in mind. I just knew I could not survive in that house any longer. I spent 2 nights sleeping in a park, hiding from police cars and kind strangers alike before hunger and cold forced me to seek help. I walked into a public library, drawn by memories of story time and warmth, and approached a librarian who reminded me of my kindergarten teacher. Within hours, I was in the system again, but this time with a file marked as requiring intervention. The group home that became my next residence housed 12 girls between the ages of 10 and 17. Pine Grove Youth Center was institutional rather than abusive, with shift workers instead of foster parents, scheduled activities instead of family life. 3 girls shared each room with metal-framed beds and small lockers for personal belongings. Meals were served cafeteria style and homework was completed during mandatory study hall. In some ways, the honesty of the arrangement was a relief. No one pretended we were family. No one made promises they would not keep. The expectations were clear, the boundaries consistent. I learned to navigate the complex social hierarchy of girls who, like me, had been discarded by the systems meant to protect them. It was at Pine Grove that I met Zoe, a fierce 13-year-old with wild hair and defiant eyes, who became my first real friend since entering foster care. She slept in the bed next to mine and stayed awake whispering stories long after lights out. She shared her contraband candy and taught me how to braid my hair in complex patterns. She made me laugh for the first time in years. Zoe had been in the system since infancy, bouncing between placements with a resilience I envied. "You cannot let them break you," she told me one night. "The minute you believe you are garbage, they win." For 6 months, we were inseparable, facing the challenges of group home life as a united front. Then came the day Zoe was called to the director's office and emerged with stunned eyes and trembling hands. A family wanted to adopt her. After nearly 14 years in the system, someone had chosen her. I felt genuine happiness for my friend mixed with a renewed sense of my own unworthiness. If Zoe, with her disciplinary record and tendency to question authority, could be wanted, what did it say about me that no one had ever come for me? The day she left carrying her possessions in the standard issue, black garbage bag, all Foster, kids recognized, she hugged me fiercely and promised to stay in touch. Like all promises in my life, it eventually proved empty as her new family moved to Arizona and our letters dwindled to nothing. Alone again, I retreated further into myself. I excelled academically because school was the one place I had control. I followed rules perfectly because compliance meant safety. I stopped forming attachments because everyone eventually left. I became a ghost drifting through the system, present but never fully seen. The summer I turned 13 marked the beginning of my transformation. Natalie, who had remained my social worker through all the placements and transitions, arrived at Pine Grove with news of yet another move. But this time, her usual professional demeanor gave way to something that looked almost like excitement. "I have a couple I think might be different," she told me as we sat in the visiting area. Laura and Daniel Morgan. They specifically asked for an older child, which is unusual. Laura grew up in foster care herself. I had heard similar promises before and responded with well-practiced indifference, packing my few possessions with mechanical efficiency. By then, the photo from the lake had been laminated after nearly disintegrating from constant handling, and I tucked it carefully between layers of clothing. The Morgans lived in a modest, colonial-style house on a quiet street lined with maple trees. Laura was a high school English teacher with bright eyes and a messy bun, while Daniel worked as an architect from a home office filled with drafting tables and miniature building models. They had no biological children, and had never fostered before me. When Laura showed me to my room, I waited for the sales pitch, the exaggerated enthusiasm, the promises I knew would eventually be broken. Instead, she simply said, "We know this is just a room to you right now, not a home. That is okay. We will give you space and time. The door has a lock and only you will have the key. Your privacy matters to us." That small acknowledgement of my reality, the lack of pressure to perform gratitude, caught me off guard. Still, I maintained my emotional distance, responding to their attempts at conversation with minimal words, testing boundaries with small acts of defiance, waiting for the mask of kindness to slip. Laura never pushed when I retreated to my room for hours. Daniel never raised his voice when I accidentally knocked over and broke a ceramic bowl. Instead of punishment, there were steady, consistent responses. Natural consequences, open conversations, genuine interest in my thoughts and feelings. 2 months into my stay, during a rare moment of shared conversation over dinner, Laura mentioned her own time in foster care. She spoke matter-of-factly about being removed from her biological mother at age 4, about the 5 placements that followed, about aging out of the system at 18, with no family support. I thought her story was a strategic revelation designed to create false intimacy. But over time, in small, non-manipulative ways, she shared more. The foster father who taught her to change oil in a car. The group home supervisor who recognized her writing talent and submitted her poem to a contest she won. The teacher who helped her apply for college scholarships. Her struggles with trust, with forming relationships, with believing she deserved good things. It was Daniel who first broke through my defenses. An unexpected rainstorm caught me walking home from the bus stop, and I arrived at the house drenched and shivering. Instead of concern about the puddles I was creating on their hardwood floors, Daniel met me with a fluffy towel, hot chocolate, with exactly the right amount of marshmallows, and 0 questions or lectures about umbrellas. The simple act of care without agenda undid something tight and defensive inside me. School had always been my refuge, the one place where I could disappear into books and learning. At my new school, I caught the attention of Miss End of UN. Hernandez, the counselor who reviewed my academic records, and called me into her office one day. "These test scores are exceptional, Alida," she said, pushing her glasses up her nose. You are performing well above grade level in most subjects. Have you thought about college? The question startled me. In my world, the future extended only to the next placement, the next transition. Long-term dreams seemed like luxuries reserved for normal kids with permanent families. When I mentioned the conversation to Laura and Daniel at dinner expecting polite disinterest, they instead launched into an animated discussion of educational possibilities. Daniel brought out a laptop and showed me websites for scholarship programs. Laura talked about her college experience, the challenges and rewards. Neither pushed or presumed, but for the first time, someone was treating my future as something valuable, something worth planning for. Small changes accumulated. I began keeping my door unlocked sometimes. I started asking questions at dinner, rather than just answering those directed at me. I accepted Laura's invitation to join her weekend book club for teens at the library. I allowed Daniel to teach me the basics of architectural drawing when I expressed curiosity about his work. The defining moment came 6 months into my placement. I had a nightmare, a recurring one about being forgotten in an empty house, and woke up screaming. Instead of irritation at being disturbed, Laura appeared at my door with calm reassurance, respecting my space by not entering without permission. When I allowed her in, she sat at the edge of my bed, not quite touching me, and asked if I wanted to talk or just have company until I fell back asleep. Something about her patience, her willingness to sit in silence without demanding explanations, broke the dam I had built around my emotions. Words poured out of me, years of hurt and confusion and abandonment spilling into the darkness of the room. Why did no one want me? What was wrong with me? Would I ever be enough for anyone? Laura listened without interruption, without platitudes, without false promises. When I finally ran out of words, she said the only thing that could have possibly helped. There is nothing wrong with you, Aletta. Nothing. The failure was never yours. It was the adults who should have protected you, who should have put your needs before their own. You deserved better. You still do. That night marked the beginning of real healing. The next day, Laura asked if I would consider talking to a professional who could help me process my experiences. Unlike previous foster parents who had viewed therapy as a way to fix what they perceived as my problems, Laura presented it as a tool for healing wounds inflicted by others, a way to reclaim my narrative. Dr. Reynolds became another key figure in my journey. A calm, straightforward woman who specialized in childhood trauma, she never treated me as a diagnosis or a case study. Our weekly sessions created space for me to examine my past without being consumed by it, to recognize patterns in my thinking and behavior that had once been necessary for survival, but now held me back from genuine connection. As trust grew with the Morgans, so did my willingness to engage with the world around me. I joined the school newspaper, discovering a talent for storytelling that Laura encouraged with writing workshops and journals. I made a cautious friend named Eliza, who invited me to study sessions and movie nights. I began volunteering at an animal shelter, finding healing in the uncomplicated affection of abandoned creatures who, like me, were waiting for someone to choose them. Through it all, the Morgans remained steady, neither pushing for artificial closeness nor withdrawing when progress was slow. They celebrated my achievements without making their approval conditional. They respected my boundaries while gently encouraging growth. They consulted me about decisions that affected my life, from vacation plans to house rules, treating my input as valuable. One evening, about a year after I arrived, Laura broached a subject we had all carefully avoided. "Have you thought about trying to contact your biological family?" she asked during dinner. "We would support you if that is something you want." The question landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples through my carefully constructed piece. I had not spoken my parents' names aloud in years, had trained myself not to wonder about Jackson and Amanda growing up without me, had buried the hope of reconciliation alongside so many other childish dreams. "No," I said finally. "They made their choice. I am making mine." Daniel nodded, respecting my decision without judgment. "But if you ever change your mind," he added, "we will be here." That simple affirmation of support, regardless of my choices, represented everything my biological family had failed to provide. The Morgans wanted what was best for me, even if that meant helping me reconnect with the very people who had abandoned me. Their love, I was slowly learning, came without conditions or expectations of return. As high school progressed, my academic achievements accumulated. Honor roll became a consistent accomplishment. Advanced placement classes challenged and engaged me. Teachers recommended me for competitive summer programs that the Morgans found ways to afford despite limited resources. When junior year brought college conversations into focus, Ms. Hernandez helped me identify schools with strong support programs for students from foster care backgrounds. Laura spent evenings helping me draft application essays that transformed my painful past into a testimony of resilience rather than victimhood. Daniel drove me to campus tours, asking insightful questions I was too overwhelmed to formulate. By senior year, something remarkable had happened. I had stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop for the Morgans to decide I was too much trouble or not worth the effort. I had begun to trust not just them, but my own worth, my own capacity for success and happiness. When acceptance letters arrived from 3 of my top choice universities along with scholarship, offers that would make attendance possible, the Morgans hosted a celebration dinner. Laura baked my favorite chocolate cake. Daniel presented me with a professional quality art portfolio for my architectural sketches, a hobby he had nurtured over the years. They invited Ms. Hernandez, Dr. Reynolds, and Eliza to share in the moment. That night, surrounded by people who had chosen to invest in me without obligation, I realized I had found what my 7-year-old self had so desperately needed, not a replacement for the family that discarded me, but something perhaps more valuable. I had found people who saw me clearly, who valued me, not despite my wounds, but including them, who believed in my future when I had barely dared to imagine one. As I prepared to leave for college, Laura and Daniel made another commitment that redefined my understanding of family. "You will always have a home here," Laura said, helping me pack my dorm essentials. "Holidays, summers, random weekends, when dorm life gets overwhelming. This room remains yours. We remain your people." For someone who had spent years being shuffled between temporary placements, the promise of permanence was revolutionary. And unlike all the broken promises that came before this one, I actually believed. College represented freedom in ways I had never experienced. For the first time, I was not defined by my status as a foster child or ward of the state. In the freshman orientation circle, when we shared fun facts about ourselves, I chose to mention my passion for architecture and creative writing, not my fragmented family history. The ability to control my own narrative felt like emerging from a dark room into brilliant sunshine. I double majored in psychology and creative writing, fascinated by the intersection of human experience and storytelling. My psychology classes helped me understand the developmental impacts of my early abandonment and subsequent years in the system. Rather than viewing this knowledge as an excuse, I used it as a framework for continued growth and healing. Through the campus work-study program, I secured a position at the University Counseling Center, answering phones and scheduling appointments. The exposure to mental health professionals in a collegiate setting revealed potential career paths I had never considered, ways to transform my painful experiences into tools for helping others. My junior year brought an internship opportunity at North Star Publishing, a company specializing in educational materials and children's books. What began as coffee runs and copy making evolved when my supervisor, Patricia, discovered my writing samples. She invited me to contribute to a new project, developing resources for elementary school guidance counselors, materials that would help young children navigate complex emotions and difficult life circumstances. The first time I saw my words in print, accompanying gentle illustrations in a book titled, "Sometimes Families Change," something shifted in my understanding of purpose. The abandoned child inside me would always exist, but her pain could be transformed into something healing, something that might reach another child sitting alone in an unfamiliar bedroom, wondering what they had done wrong. Graduation arrived with job offers, including a full-time position with North Star. The Morgans attended the ceremony, cheering loudly when my name was called, hosting a celebration afterward. That included Dr. Reynolds and Miss Hernandez, both of whom had remained in contact throughout my college years. Their collective presence represented the chosen family I had built. Proof that belonging could be created, rather than merely inherited. My early professional years brought both challenges and triumphs. I moved into my first apartment, a small one-bedroom walk-up with uneven floors and excellent natural light. The process of furnishing it piece by piece, making decisions about colors and textures, creating a space that reflected my tastes and needs, was healing in ways I had not anticipated. This was mine earned through my own efforts, a physical manifestation of the stability I had created for myself. It was during this period that I met Paul. He worked in marketing at North Star with an easy laugh and thoughtful questions that made me feel both seen and respected. Our friendship evolved naturally into dating my first serious relationship. Paul was patient with my trust issues, understanding when I needed space, supportive of my career ambitions. But as the relationship deepened, my old fears resurfaced. When Paul began talking about moving in together, about building a future that assumed permanence, I found myself pulling away. The vulnerability required for true intimacy triggered deeply ingrained protection mechanisms. Despite therapy and years of healing, part of me remained convinced that anyone who truly knew me would eventually leave. The breakup was painful but necessary. Paul deserved someone capable of the commitment he wanted, and I needed to recognize that my healing journey was ongoing. We parted with mutual respect, another adult experience navigated without catastrophe. Another lesson in my continuing education about human connection. A promotion at North Star offered the opportunity to relocate to Chicago, heading up a new imprint focused specifically on books supporting children through trauma and transition. The decision to move meant leaving the geographical safety net of the Morgans, who had remained my touchstone throughout college and early adulthood. Our goodbye dinner was emotional, but not final. Family transcends distance. Laura reminded me, helping me pack my kitchen items with the same care she had shown when preparing me for college. Chicago brought professional fulfillment beyond what I had imagined possible. I assembled a team of writers, illustrators, and child psychologists committed to creating resources that addressed real issues children face, from divorce and death to foster care and adoption. My personal experiences informed the work without dominating it, allowing me to advocate authentically for content that neither sugar-coated difficulties nor left children without hope. My series for foster children, titled You Belong, won industry recognition and was adopted by social service agencies across multiple states. The books acknowledge the confusion, anger, and grief many foster children experience while offering tools for resilience and self-worth. Letters began arriving from foster parents and social workers, sharing stories of children who found comfort and voice in these books. Children who recognized their own experiences in the pages and felt less alone. Outside of work, I gradually built a life rich in chosen connections. Claire, my neighbor in the apartment across the hall, became a close friend who introduced me to her book club and running group. Jasmine, a graphic designer I met through a community art class, brought me into her diverse social circle of creative professionals. Neither friendship came with the complications of shared childhood or family obligation, allowing me to practice vulnerability and trust in relationships built entirely on mutual choice and compatibility. The purchase of my first home, a 2-bedroom condo in a converted warehouse building, represented a milestone I once could not have imagined. The mortgage approval, the key in my hand, the freedom to paint walls and replace fixtures, all symbolized a level of permanence and self-sufficiency that 7-year-old Aleda, waiting for someone to claim her, could never have envisioned. I established traditions that honored my journey rather than erasing it. Each year, on the anniversary of entering foster care, I donated books to children in the system. On my birthday, I treated myself to something that would have delighted my childhood self, like art supplies or a day at an amusement park. These rituals acknowledged both the pain of my past and my triumph over it, integrating my full story into the person I had become. Volunteer work became another cornerstone of my life. I trained as a court-appointed special advocate for foster children, using my professional knowledge and personal experience to ensure vulnerable children had someone focused exclusively on their best interests during legal proceedings. The work was emotionally demanding but deeply meaningful, allowing me to be the advocate I had needed during my own time in the system. Occasionally, I would allow myself to wonder about Jackson and Amanda, imagining what their lives might have become. These thoughts no longer carried the desperate yearning of childhood, but rather a quiet curiosity. I had made peace with the reality that some questions might never be answered, some wounds never fully explained. My worth was no longer tied to understanding why I had been the one left behind. The life I built was not perfect, but it was authentically mine. Every aspect reflected choices I had made, values I had developed, strengths I had cultivated through adversity. I was not merely surviving but thriving. Not defined by abandonment, but by the resilience and compassion it had taught me. The scared little girl who once believed herself unworthy of love had grown into a woman who understood her own value and contributed meaningfully to the world around her. Then, after 20 years of silence, the past came knocking at my door. The Facebook message arrived on an ordinary Tuesday morning as I was sipping coffee and reviewing manuscript submissions. The notification seemed innocuous, until I saw the name Jackson Walker, my brother. My finger hovered over the screen, heart pounding with such force I could feel it in my throat. 20 years of silence, and now a digital bridge to the family that had discarded me. The message preview showed only the first line, "Aletta, I know, it has been a long time." For several minutes I sat paralyzed, unsure whether to open or delete the message. Part of me, the well-adjusted adult who had built a successful life, felt curiosity rather than pain. Another part, the wounded child who still lived within me, recoiled in protective fear. Eventually, professional curiosity won out. I opened the message. "Aletta, I know it has been a long time, but I have been trying to find you for months. Dad is sick. Cancer. The doctors say maybe 6 months. He has been asking for you. I know we have no right, but would you consider talking to me? Maybe a phone call, I understand if you say no." The words landed like stones, each one creating ripples of complex emotion. Dad, sick, dying. The man who had chosen my brother but not me now wanted contact after 2 decades of silence. The audacity was breathtaking. I closed the laptop without responding, needing time to process this unexpected intrusion from the past. I called Dr. Reynolds, who had remained an occasional resource during major life transitions, and scheduled an emergency session. Then I took a personal day from work, something I rarely did, and spent hours walking along Lake Michigan trying to sort through the tangle of feelings the message had triggered. A week passed before I felt capable of crafting a response. I kept it brief and non-committal. I need more information before considering any meeting. Why now? Where has everyone been for 20 years? What exactly does he want from me? Jackson responded almost immediately, as if he had been waiting by his computer. The message was long, filled with explanations that read like excuses. Dad had struggled with alcoholism for years, before finally getting sober 5 years ago. They had moved frequently during my childhood, making it difficult for social services to maintain contact. They had thought I was with Mom until learning otherwise years later. They had searched for me on and off, but respected my right to privacy when preliminary inquiries suggested I wanted no contact. Each justification felt hollow, crafted to minimize their abandonment rather than acknowledge its impact. Still, curiosity compelled me to continue the exchange to fill in the gaps of my fractured family history. Over several messages, I learned that Jackson lived just 90 minutes away in Milwaukee, working as an electrical engineer. Dad had settled in Indianapolis after his recovery, starting a small handyman business. They had maintained regular contact throughout the years I spent being shuffled through the foster care system. Before I could fully process these revelations, another message arrived, this one via email from an address I did not recognize. The subject line read simply, "Your sister." Amanda had found me too. Her message struck a different tone than Jackson's, less apologetic and more entitled. Our mother had apparently seen my photo in a publishing industry magazine article and recognized me immediately. According to Amanda, Mom had spent years regretting the family split and had tried repeatedly to reunite us all. She claimed that Child Protective Services had denied her attempts to regain custody of me, a narrative that contradicted everything I knew about my case. Within the span of 2 weeks, all 3 remaining members of my biological family had surfaced, each with their own version of history, each expressing desire for reunion, each conveniently appearing just as I had built a successful life they can use and expel. might benefit from. The most devastating revelation came buried in Jackson's third message, almost as an afterthought. By the way, Mom and Dad reconciled about 10 years ago. We all spent holidays together after that. Amanda and I have always stayed close. The words hit me with physical force. While I had navigated the foster care system alone, enduring abuse and neglect, forming my identity in institutional settings, they had reconstructed a family unit without me. They had Sunday dinners and Christmas mornings and birthday celebrations, creating new memories while I fought simply to survive. The exclusion felt like abandonment all over again, a fresh wound atop the scarred tissue of old injuries. When I shared these developments with Laura during our weekly phone call, her protective instincts flared immediately. "You do not owe them anything," she reminded me. "Not your time, not your forgiveness, not your success story. Whatever you decide, Daniel and I support you completely." Claire and Jasmine offered similar perspectives when I finally shared my family history with them over wine in my living room. Neither had known the details of my background before, as I generally presented myself as simply estranged from family rather than abandoned by them. Their outrage on my behalf was validating their protective advice, affirming my right to maintain the boundaries I had established. Yet amid the justified anger and resentment, swirled more complicated emotions. Curiosity about the people who shared my blood and features. Questions that had lingered unanswered throughout my life. A childish, irrational hope that perhaps they had changed, had recognized the magnitude of their failure, had become people capable of the accountability and amends that might begin to address the harm they had caused. Jackson grew increasingly persistent in his messages. "Dad is asking for you daily. His condition is deteriorating faster than expected. He needs to make peace before he goes." Amanda took a more manipulative approach. "Forgiveness is for you, not for them," she wrote. Co-opting therapeutic language she clearly did not understand. "Family is everything. Blood is thicker than water. You cannot move forward while holding on to the past." Their pressure triggered anxiety attacks I had not experienced in years. Sleep became elusive, concentration difficult. The carefully constructed peace I had built began showing cracks, old insecurities seeping through like groundwater after a heavy rain. During an emergency session, Dr. Reynolds helped me identify what was happening. "Your biological family abandoned you," she observed, "but you survived and thrived without them. Their sudden appearance threatens the narrative of independence you have built. It is natural to feel destabilized." She guided me through exercises to reconnect with my adult resources and perspective, to distinguish between the vulnerable child who had been harmed and the capable adult who now had choices. The decision to engage or maintain distance was mine alone, with no obligation to people who had forfeited their right to my consideration 20 years earlier. After much reflection, I agreed to meet Jackson at a coffee shop halfway between our cities. I chose a public location for its safety and easy exit if needed, arriving early to select a table with clear sightlines to the door and restrooms, old survival habits automatically engaging. He arrived 5 minutes late, a tall man with familiar eyes who bore only slight resemblance to the 9-year-old boy who had left without looking back. The conversation was awkward, full of long pauses and careful navigation around the elephants crowding our small table. Jackson spoke of Dad's illness, his treatment options, his expressed regrets. He described their life after leaving the apartments and jobs and struggles that followed. When he finally addressed the central question of why they had left me behind, his explanation was painfully inadequate. Dad was drinking heavily then. He could barely handle taking care of one kid. He thought you would be better off with Mom. And when he learned I was in foster care, I asked, my voice steady despite the turmoil beneath. Jackson looked down at his coffee. He was still drinking then, fighting his own demons. By the time he got sober and tried to find you, years had passed. The social worker said you were in a stable placement and did not want contact. Whether this was truth or convenient fiction, I could not determine. What was clear was Jackson's expectation that these explanations should suffice, that understanding the circumstances should naturally lead to forgiveness and reunion. The conversation took a revealing turn when he mentioned Dad's medical bills and the financial strain of his treatments. There was no direct request, but the implication hung in the air, the suggestion that family helps family, especially family who has achieved professional success and financial stability. I left that meeting with clarity I had not possessed before. This was not about reconciliation or healing. This was about utility. After being deemed disposable as a child, I was now being evaluated for usefulness as an adult. The irony was not lost on me. I declined Jackson's invitation to visit Dad in Indianapolis, his suggestion that we bring Amanda into our conversations, his thinly veiled hints about financial assistance. I walked away from that coffee shop with shoulders straight and head high, no longer the abandoned child but a woman who understood her worth and refused to accept less than she deserved. In the weeks following my meeting with Jackson, I entered a period of intense self-reflection. Each morning, I woke early to write in my journal, examining my feelings without judgment, distinguishing between the pull of biological connection and the reality of my lived experience. These pages became a conversation with myself, a way to process the complex emotions triggered by my family's sudden reappearance. My weekly calls with Laura took on new significance during this time. Unlike my biological parents, she had no agenda beyond my well-being. No investment beyond wanting me to thrive. 20 years after entering my life, she remained a steady presence, offering wisdom without directive support, without condition. "What do you want from them, Aletta?" she asked one evening. "Not what they want from you, but what would constitute a satisfying outcome for you in this situation?" The question reframed my thinking entirely. I had been so focused on responding to their demands and expectations that I had not considered my own. What did I want? Closure, perhaps. Acknowledgement of the harm done. Not a fairy tale reunion, but perhaps an honest reckoning that would allow me to fully release the lingering questions that had shadowed parts of my life. After much consideration, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and empowering. I would meet with all of them together once on my terms. Not to foster ongoing relationships or meet deathbed demands, but to speak my truth to the people who needed most to hear it. To close this chapter definitively, rather than allowing it to remain perpetually unfinished. I arranged the meeting at a community center conference room in Indianapolis neutral territory that belonged to neither them nor me. I requested that Dr. Reynolds attend as both support and mediator, a professional presence to maintain boundaries and perspective. I specified a 2-hour time limit, no gifts or photos, and made clear this was not necessarily the beginning of ongoing contact, but rather an opportunity for communication after 2 decades of silence. The days leading up to the meeting were turbulent. I experienced nightmares about being 7 again, standing in that living room while my family fractured around me. I doubted my decision, questioned my strength, considered canceling multiple times. Claire and Jasmine took turns checking on me, bringing meals when anxiety stole my appetite, listening as I rehearsed what I needed to say. The morning of the meeting, I stood before my mirror, deliberately selecting an outfit that made me feel confident and professional, armor of a sort against the vulnerability to come. I was no longer the powerless child they had discarded, but Dr. Alida Walker, published author and advocate, a woman who had built meaning from the wreckage they had left behind. Walking into that conference room was like stepping into a surreal collision of past and present. Dad, gaunt from illness, but still recognizably, the man who had walked away with my brother. Mom, hair now streaked with gray, but wearing the same excessive jewelry that had jingled when she clutched Amanda to her chest. My siblings, adult versions of the children who had gone with their preferred parent while I remained unclaimed. The initial exchanges were stilted, heavy, with 2 decades of absence. Dad attempted joviality as if we were merely catching up after a brief separation. Mom dabbed at tears that seemed to appear on cue. Amanda spoke rapidly about how wonderful it was to be reunited, constructing a narrative that ignored the circumstances of our separation. Jackson watched me with calculation, perhaps assessing whether his efforts at reconnection would yield the results he sought. Dr. Reynolds skillfully guided the conversation toward substance rather than superficial pleasantries. "We are here today," she noted, "because Aletta has graciously agreed to meet with you after 20 years of no contact. Perhaps we should begin by acknowledging that reality." What followed was a masterclass in evasion and revisionist history. Dad blamed his alcoholism for choices he presented as beyond his control. Mom claimed to have been suffering from undiagnosed depression that impaired her judgment. Both insisted they had believed I was being cared for by the other, until learning otherwise years later, a fiction that fell apart under the most basic scrutiny. My siblings offered their own versions of events shaped by loyalty to the parents who had chosen them, and by their need to justify their own lack of initiative in finding me. Amanda, who had been 5 when our family fractured, had the most excuse for her ignorance, yet seemed the most invested in minimizing what had happened. "I am sorry if you felt abandoned," she said, employing the classic non-apology that locates the problem in the perception rather than the action. "But we were all just doing our best in a difficult situation." Throughout their explanations and justifications, I remained silent, allowing them to reveal themselves through their words, their omissions, their body language. I saw clearly how they had constructed narratives that absolved them of responsibility, that transformed their abandonment of a child into an unfortunate circumstance beyond anyone's control. When they had exhausted their explanations, when the room fell quiet with expectation, I finally spoke. My voice was steady, the result of weeks of preparation and years of healing work. 20 years ago, I stood in our living room and watched my family divide like property in a divorce. Dad took Jackson, Mom took Amanda, and no one took me. I was 7 years old, trying to understand what I had done wrong, why I was the only one no one wanted. I detailed my journey through the foster care system not to elicit pity, but to ensure they understood the consequences of their actions. The Bradleys who exploited me for foster payments, the Millers who eroded my self-worth with constant criticism, the Simpsons who left bruises on my arms and locked me in closets, the group home where I learned to disappear to survive. I spoke of running away at 11, of sleeping in a park, because it felt safer than my foster home of the library, where I finally sought help because hunger and cold overcame fear. I described birthdays with no cards, Christmases with no family school events attended only by social workers or temporary caregivers who often did not know my grade level or interests. Through it all, I maintained eye contact, refusing to soften the reality to ease their discomfort. Mom cried more dramatically as my story progressed. Dad stared at his hands. Dad stared at his hands. Jackson and Amanda exchanged uncomfortable glances, perhaps confronting for the first time the stark contrast between their experiences and mine. When I described finding stability with the Morgans, pursuing education, building a career and life of meaning, their expressions shifted subtly. Relief that my story had a happy ending, mingled with something that looked like calculation, particularly in Jackson's eyes. The subtext was clear: if I had overcome and succeeded, perhaps my trauma was not so significant after all. Perhaps their debt was not so great. I anticipated this reaction, this minimization of harm based on outcome rather than intent. "I have built a good life," I acknowledged. "But I did so, despite what you did, not because of it. My success does not erase your abandonment or absolve you of responsibility for your choices." Then I addressed each of them individually, speaking truths that had waited 20 years for voice. To Dad, I acknowledged his illness without accepting it as justification for his absence. To Mom, I rejected her tears as insufficient currency for the childhood she had stolen. To my siblings, I expressed understanding of their childhood helplessness while questioning their adult complacency in the family narrative. "I am not here to negotiate ongoing relationships," I explained. "I am here to reclaim my story from the fiction you have created to comfort yourselves." I was not lost. I was abandoned. I was not temporarily misplaced. I was deliberately left behind. I was not better off without you. I was traumatized by your rejection. The silence that followed was heavy with reckoning, with truths too stark for easy response. Dad attempted to speak first, offering what he clearly believed was a meaningful apology. "I was a different man then," he said. "If I could go back and change things, I would." "But you cannot," I replied simply. "And intentions do not heal wounds. Actions might, but even those have limitations." Mom took a different approach, leaning into dramatic emotion. "My baby," she wailed, reaching across the table toward me. "I have thought of you every day. I have prayed for this moment." I did not extend my hand to meet hers. "Your actions tell a different story," I observed. You reconciled with Dad. You maintained relationships with Jackson and Amanda. You created a family unit that deliberately excluded me for decades. You made choices repeatedly that prioritized your comfort over my well-being. My siblings attempted various interventions. Jackson emphasizing Dad's limited time, Amanda invoking Christian forgiveness, both clearly uncomfortable with the unvarnished truth disrupting their familiar narrative. I listened to their perspectives without yielding ground, maintaining the boundaries I had established for this interaction. When the designated 2 hours neared completion, I delivered the message that represented my purpose for the meeting. "I forgive you," I said, watching surprise register on their faces. "Not because you deserve forgiveness, but because I deserve peace. Not because you have earned it, but because carrying anger gives you power over me that you have not earned. I forgive you for my sake, not yours." I established clear parameters for any future contact. I would not be visiting Dad in hospice or attending his funeral. I would not be joining family gatherings or holiday celebrations. I would consider limited structured communication via email initiated no more frequently than monthly, with no expectation of response. I would not provide financial assistance or emotional labor. I would not pretend that 20 years of absence could or should be erased. As the meeting concluded, their reactions revealed much about the people they had become. Dad seemed genuinely sorrowful, yet still self-focused, concerned primarily with securing absolution before death. Mom alternated between theatrical grief and thinly veiled resentment at my refusal to embrace her narrative. Jackson appeared calculating, reassessing his approach now that financial assistance seemed unlikely. Amanda alone showed glimmers of genuine reflection, perhaps beginning to question the family story she had accepted, without examination. I left that room walking taller than when I entered, no longer carrying the weight of unanswered questions and unspoken truths. The journey back to Chicago felt like physical movement toward my real life, away from the gravity of a past that no longer defined me. That evening, I called Laura to share what had happened. Her pride in my courage and boundaries wrapped around me like a warm embrace despite the physical distance between us. "You have become exactly who you were meant to be," she said. "Whole and strong and compassionate without being a doormat. You set boundaries that honor your worth while still allowing for your own healing." In the months that followed, I maintained those boundaries despite continued attempts by my biological family to negotiate different terms. Dad died 6 weeks after our meeting, and Jackson sent a guilt-inducing message about his dying wish to see me once more. I acknowledged his grief without accepting responsibility for his disappointment. Mom increased her emotional appeals, sending flowers to my office and lengthy emails recounting her suffering. I returned the flowers and responded to the emails with brief factual acknowledgments devoid of the emotional engagement she sought. The experience of asserting my narrative and establishing boundaries based on my needs, rather than their expectations, proved transformative in unexpected ways. I began a support group for adult former foster children, navigating complex family dynamics, creating space for others to process similar experiences of abandonment and potential reconciliation. Each week, sitting in a circle of people who understood without explanation, I found healing in facilitating healing for others. My professional work evolved as well. I began writing a memoir chronicling my journey through the foster care system and beyond, not as a victim story, but as a testament to resilience and the possibility of creating family through choice, rather than biology. The writing process, though sometimes painful, allowed me to integrate all aspects of my experience into a coherent narrative that belonged fully to me. The Morgans remained my true family, the people who had chosen me when I most needed choosing. Laura and Daniel attended my book launch, beaming with pride as I signed copies and spoke to an audience that included social workers, foster parents, and fellow system survivors. Their consistent presence in my life demonstrated daily that family is defined by love and commitment rather than genetic connection. My relationship with my biological family settled into a distant, carefully managed connection. Monthly emails, usually initiated by Amanda, who seemed most capable of respecting my boundaries, provided basic updates without expectation of emotional investment. I responded when I felt genuine interest in doing so, abstained when I did not, exercising the agency that had been denied to 7-year-old Aletta, standing unclaimed in that living room. The healing was not perfect or complete. Certain triggers could still activate old pain. Certain milestone days still carried shadows of what might have been. But these moments no longer defined or derailed me. They became merely weather patterns moving through the larger landscape of a life rich with meaning, connection, and purpose. In the end, the most powerful realization was not that I had survived abandonment, but that I had created something beautiful and meaningful from that broken beginning. The child no one wanted had become a woman who wanted herself, who valued her own worth, independent of external validation, who understood that the opposite of abandonment is not possession, but presence, not control, but care. If you have ever been left behind, discarded, or deemed disposable, know this: you can build a life worthy of your survival. You can create family from choice rather than obligation. You can transform wounds into wisdom. And most importantly, you can become the author of your own story, writing an ending far more powerful than your beginning. Have you ever had to rebuild your life after profound betrayal or abandonment? Share your experience in the comments below. Your story matters and might help someone else feeling alone in their struggle. If this resonated with you, please like and subscribe for more stories of resilience and healing. And remember, the family that matters most is often the one you create through love and choice, not the one you were born into. Thank you for witnessing my journey.